The 126th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Grossman, but you can please call me Jag. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways like graphic novels and animated videos. Today, we are joined by Dr. Rainier Zitelman. Before I even begin to introduce our guest today, I want to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. Go ahead, start typing in your questions on any of those platforms, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So I'm really thrilled to have this guest with us today, Dr. Rainier Zitelman. You are going to hear a lot of overlap between some of the topics that he researches and writes about, as well as Ayn Rand. He is a German historian. He's a sociologist. He taught in academia before transitioning to the private sector as a successful entrepreneur, real estate investor, and of course, a world-renowned author of 25 books, including The Power of Capitalism, The Rich in Public Opinion, The Art of a Successful Life, and Hitler's National Socialism. We're also going to talk about his upcoming book, In Defense of Capitalism. Dr. Zitelman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I'm now here in Miami. The United States are not so far away as usually because I'm based in Berlin, in Germany.
Well, that's fantastic. We love to have you here, selfishly. We'd love to keep you, but I know you're a traveling man. And our audience is always interested in origin stories. So tell us a bit about you, what influenced your early interest in political science and sociology. I understand, for example, your father was a preacher, so I'd be interested in how his views on money may have influenced you, or whether you kind of rebelled against them.
I have a very good contact today with my father. He's 93 years old and he's still writing books, but he's more left-leaning, as of course I was. And when I was young, to have a left-leaning father and then to go in opposition, you have two possibilities. The first would be to go very extreme right-wing, this was not my way, or extreme left-wing, this was my way. So I was very left-leaning. When I was 13 years old, I founded a Maoist group at my school, and I had a newspaper, I edited a newspaper, Red Banner, and had always this contact with Beijing, and they sent me their newspapers and so for Beijing. So I was really a left-wing extremist, and I read all these books by Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, everything. Even I got, when I was 14 years old, I gave seminars to students that were 10 or 15 years older than me about Marxist theory and all this stuff. So this was how I started. And of course, later on, it changed. Then it was a period, maybe 10 years in my life that I was so very left-leaning. And then later on, I studied history and political science, and I wrote my first doctoral dissertation about Adolf Hitler's worldview. You announced this book. It was republished now some month ago in English language as Hitler's National Socialism. And yes, then I was assistant at the Free University of Berlin. And after this, I was in a leading position of one of the leading German newspapers. And then I founded my own company I was older, with 43 years old. And it was a very successful public relation company. I made a lot of money at this time, and I made a lot of very good investments at this time. And 15 years later, I sold the company And then I returned back to what I do today, writing my books, doing my research, traveling all over the world. And I can do it because I'm financial free, because my research is very, very expensive and you don't get it back from selling books. I can tell you for my next book, In Defense of Capitalism, the costs for the, we do polls in 27 countries. If I add the expenses for the polls, then I give some money for translation costs, and then for this traveling expenses, it will be more than $1 million. And of course, you can't get it back from selling the books, even if they sell good. So, but I can do it now. Other wealthy people, they buy maybe a new car, so I have the same car since 15 years, and so I don't need another car. But I love to do my research and writing my books.
Well, we're really very grateful for that. Now, thinking back also in the era in which you grew up, I think you were probably about 4 years old when the Berlin Wall first went up. And then you talk about this time in your 30s of being a Maoist, but that was also a time when the wall came down. I wonder if any reflections on that time, what it was like to live in Germany with the wall and then without the wall, your experience during the time of transition and reunification.
Yes, it's correct what you said. I was 4 years old when they built the wall, but I was not a Marxist with my 30s, but as a teenager. So I was between 13 and 23. So when the wall came down, it was a very long time ago, but then I wasn't a Marxist or something like this. Yes, to remember, even by the way, I can recommend everyone can Google it on the internet. I produced a film, Life Behind the Berlin Wall, together with the Free to Choose network, and you can find it for free on the internet. And I'm proud that we got an award for this film at the Anthem Film Festival at Freedom Fest in July. And so, yes, at this time, Germany was divided in East and West, and I lived in West Germany. And this was maybe the reason why I became Maoist, because this was so close to us, East Germany, and we know that it was bad there. And we know that it was bad in Eastern Europe and in Russia, but China was far away, and we could project all our young utopian fantasies about perfect society to China, because of course I wasn't there in China, it was so far away. And the only thing that I knew about China at this time was what I read every week in Beijing Review, that they send in German language to us, and this propaganda. And we didn't like East Germany, the political system, and Soviet Union. These were also our enemies at the same time as capitalists. So we believed in this Mao system. Today, of course, I know how really terrible it was, and that yes, in the time when I was 1 or 2 years old, this great leap forward happened in China, and a lot of people don't know about it. I speak about it all over the world because my book, The Power of Capitalism, starts with a chapter about China and with the so-called Great Leap Forward, where 45 million people died. And I asked everywhere in the world, young people, have you ever heard about this at school? And only very few people raised their hand. Most of them haven't heard anything about it. And I think it's terrible, because this was the biggest socialist experiment in history, and 45 million people died. And they don't teach them at school. I had a controversial on Twitter in Germany with someone left-leaning, and he said, no, I don't think that people should learn this at school. And I said, why not? Yes, it happened in China, and this is far away, and why should we be interested in this? But would he say the same thing if it is about slavery in United States or something like this, and it's not far away. So
right, or of course, National Socialism. Your scholarship and your books have made you perhaps the world's leading expert on Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, including your book, Hitler's National Socialism, which, as you mentioned, was just republished. How much did the egalitarian ideals of socialism inspire Hitler's project? And what are some of the ways in which the conventional views of Hitler should be revised according to your perspective? For example, you know, people say, oh, Hitler was a fascist, not a socialist. How did he view it, and what's your take?
So he called himself a socialist, and of course he was not a socialist in this way as the communists are, because he was against nationalization of all private property in the first place. But this doesn't mean that he introduced private property. He had another idea. So in some of his speeches, he explained it this way. We, the state, tell the entrepreneurs, you have to do this and that. And if they do it, we are fine with this. Everything's okay, then we don't have to do that. But if they retract, then we will tell them, you have to do it. And if they don't do it, then we will do it. The state will do it. So this was his philosophy. And so he wasn't in no way a supporter of private property. And one of the results, what I show in my book, that starting in the middle of the 30s, and especially in the beginning of the 40s, he became more and more an admirer of the planned economy in Soviet Union, and even an admirer of Stalin. Of course, in his public speeches, he was very anti-communist and anti-Soviet Union, but if he spoke in his inner circle, and we have a lot of notes about his so-called table talks, his monologues in the Führer headquarters, he spoke very positive about Stalin and Soviet Union. He said there were no people jobless as in the United States, and he thought that the planned economy in the Soviet Union is much superior to capitalism. And this was what he thought. And so his idea was, and he said it several times, after the war, the German economy should be more and more transferred. He started to transfer it in the planned economy, but this was only the beginning. He said it in one of his table talks, in this process of restructuring the German economy as a planned economy, we are only at the beginning. And so in this way, he wasn't a socialist in this Marxist way with nationalization of all private property, because he was a social Darwinist, and so he believed in competition. And he was afraid that if you nationalize everything, that there is no more competition, and because as a socialist Darwinist, competition was very important for them. But more important for him was what he called the primacy of the politics, so that the state has to tell the entrepreneurs what to do.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's get to your study, The Wealth Elite, a groundbreaking study of the psychology of the super rich. Tell us a bit about what you hoped to set out to investigate, your methodology, and some of your findings about the psychology of the super rich.
Yes, by the way, we speak now about my second doctoral dissertation. I have 2 PhDs. The first one was this about Hitler, and the second one was this, but it's only now 7 years ago, the second one. And at this time, I was an entrepreneur and I was rich, so I did it in in the time when I was entrepreneur, I started to write in the evening or the weekend in my vacation. I worked on this. And what did I do? There are a lot of books, how to get rich, and some of them are good, but a lot of them are bad. And what I found out that there is almost no scientific research, especially in the topic about the connection between personality traits on the one hand and financial success on the other hand. And in all of the self-help books, they are not science-based. And this is the difference that I'm a scientist, I believe in scientific research, and a quantitative research about this group is not possible because this group is so very small that you can't have something, you can't find them if you do a poll like you do it with other research. So what I did, you call it in sociology qualitative research. I had 45 interviews with very wealthy people. The poorest of them had a net worth between 10 and 30 million dollars. It's but more than 30 million dollars. Most of them were between 30 million and 1 billion, and some of them were multi-billionaires. And I spoke with 45 of them, with everyone between 1 and 2 hours. And in the end, I had 1,700 pages with transcriptions, so a lot to analyze. And in addition to this, everyone completed a psychological test. This is a so-called Big Five test about 5 personality traits. So I had a lot of things to analyze, and what I wanted to find out whether there's any relationship between their personality traits and their financial success. And I found some patterns. Everyone want to find what do they have in common. And first, to be honest, not all rich people are the same, as not all poor people are the same. But this is correct on the one hand. On the other hand, you can find something that they have in common in their biography, in their attitudes, in their psychology. And yes, this was the topic of my doctoral dissertation.
Yes, so I think I recall conscientiousness was a high prevalence personality trait. Also self-confidence, believing that you can do something, a bit of a trailblazer, not necessarily always feeling like you had to follow the beaten path. One of the other striking findings I found in your study was that many of the super rich were competitive athletes in their youth. And I thought that was interesting because by contrast, they weren't necessarily academic overachiever. And that certainly contradicts popular stereotypes about dumb jocks versus, the nerds. And it brings to mind some of the people that we have profiled, like Chip Wilson, founder of Lululemon. What are some other examples that you found?
No, this is absolutely correct. Maybe I go more in detail about this topic. I asked every one of them how they were at school, about their performance at school and university. And the result is there was absolutely no relationship between their performance at school or university on the one hand and their later financial success on the other hand. Some of them were very good at school or had even doctor degree. Others, they even had no high school degree and nothing. So this was not important. But then I asked them about the activities outside school, alongside school. And two things were striking. One thing was, you mentioned this, half of them were competitive athletes. And I think they learned a lot, especially how to win, but much more important, how to lose. Mm-hmm. How to deal with setbacks and with crisis. I think this was very important. And the other thing was, a lot of them earned money with early entrepreneurial activities. So when I was young as a student, the other students, they earned money, for example, taxi driver or working in a restaurant or even in a factory. So they worked for an hourly wage. But the rich people, they earned money in sales, for example. They sold, they had so many ideas what to sell, and early entrepreneurial activities. And I think these experiences were much more important than this what they learned at school and in university. And this is a very important thing. Intellectuals don't understand it, that there are two different ways of learning. In psychology, we distinguish between what we call implicit learning and explicit learning. Explicit learning, it's like what you learn at school or university, book wisdom. And this is one way to learn, important, of course, but there's another way, we call it implicit learning. This is learning by doing. This is what they did. You don't realize that you learn at this moment, but you learn something. And this is this implicit learning results in this what we call implicit knowledge. Another word is intuition or gut feeling. And this was also one of the results. I asked every one of them, how do you make your decision? Of course, every one of us, we need both. We need our intuition, gut feeling, and we need analysis. And I asked them, what is more important for you when you make decision in business? And most of them said, okay, I've used both, but gut feeling is more important. And then some people think gut feeling is something irrational or even mystical, but this is nonsense. It's not gut feeling, it's only another word. This is the result from this implicit learning process. And this is what intellectuals don't understand. I read this very good book by Ayn Rand about intellectuals, and she grabbed it also. This is what intellectuals, they don't understand the way how entrepreneurs learn. They only understand her book wisdom. And for intellectuals this way, if you read a lot of books, then you should have the highest position in society. And this is what teachers tell them and what they learn at university. This was also my background. My father was a priest, but he was also an academic, very well-read man, and read a lot of books. And what I learned and what all these academics think, as more books you read, the higher should be your position in society. And later they learn then, if they leave university, oh, maybe there's my former school neighbor who has now maybe 5 McDonald's franchise or something like this, and he has the bigger car, the bigger house, and what's the worst thing, the prettier woman or prettier wife. And then you think, something is not correct with the market. Something's not correct with capitalism, because I should have the prettier wife and the better car because I read much more books than this stupid entrepreneur that has now only 5 McDonald's, and he was bad at school. And so this is the thing, because they don't understand intellectuals why why implicit learning is so important. And in my other book, about the power of capitalism, I have one chapter. This is my favorite chapter, why intellectuals don't like capitalism. And this is one of the reasons.
We're going to get to that. And I also thank you for bringing up Ayn Rand, because I understand that you have read quite a bit of her nonfiction, and I know that you quote her extensively in your book. So we're going to get to that. But we also have quite a few people who are popping in with questions, and I want to keep that conversation going. So I'm going to reach in and grab a couple of them that I think are interesting, maybe a little bit off the topic, but relevant to particularly what you were discussing before with your early Maoist roots. My Modern Galt on Instagram is asking, from a sociology perspective, do you think that the current cancel culture in the West is a version of the struggle sessions in communist China?
Sure, it started like this, and I wouldn't say it's the same, because in the end it makes a difference whether you are cancelled and you're an outsider, or whether they kill you or they torture you. And this is what happened in China. But don't forget, words can become deeds, and it always starts at this way, without without canceling people, hate speech against rich people, for example. This is one of my topics, or against people who have only a different opinion. It starts with hate speech, and in the end, words can become deeds. So I wouldn't say it's the same, but it's the beginning, and we should be very sensitive, because there's always the danger that it becomes more and more extreme. I give you one example. Protesters in Washington, D.C., they positioned a guillotine in front of the house of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, a guillotine. So some people left people find it funny. A guillotine, it's funny. But I think it's in no way funny, because it's like people were killed in the French Revolution, and they would show that that's what we should do with Jeff Bezos. And you have this T-shirts you can buy it on the internet, kill the rich or eat the rich, or something like this. And it starts with this, and they find it funny maybe. But for me, if I see things like this, for example, in Berlin, we had a big demonstration protest, and they had this slogan, kill your landlord. And when I saw it, I thought, what would people say if there's a poster like kill black people or kill Muslims? Everyone would be outraged, and rightly so. But with rich people, seems to be okay. No one is, and so we should be very, very careful, because we know it from history with Jewish people. It's anti-Semitism. So it started with crazy ideology. It started with hate speech, and later on it became very, very dangerous. So I would say yes, it's the same kind of thinking, and we should be very careful that it can always become worse. This is what people sometimes don't understand. I come now from a conference from Students for Liberty here in Miami, and there were refugees from Cuba and Venezuela, and they reminded the audience for one thing. Venezuela was 50 years ago one of the 20 richest countries in the world, and it was a democracy, and everyone thought there, it couldn't happen here. We are a democracy and one of the richest countries, and it happened there. Now 25% of population fled there. People are in hunger. There's a dictatorship. And she said, don't think about United States. It can't happen here, because it is the same what people thought in Venezuela. It can't happen there.
Absolutely. And it all begins with envy. And we're going to get to that. Candace Jones on Facebook is asking about the terms left and right. She is saying that weren't those terms originally used by communists and socialists when they were fighting each other in the 20s and 30s? Why do we continue to use the terms left and right today?
I think in every country, in some countries, it has no meaning at all. But in the United States and in Europe, most people think of themselves in a way like left and right. And of course, it has different meanings today. But and of course, there's a more important differentiation between collectivist approach and individualistic approach. And some people on the far left and far right have some things in common, their collectivistic approach. But of course, as an intellectual, you can think about it, and I know every intellectual tells me, it's not important, and right and left, it has no meaning. But for most of the people, they know whether they position themselves anyway. And later on I can tell you about my latest poll. I commissioned a poll now in 29 countries about the image of capitalism. And one of the questions was, we asked everyone to position himself on the left-right scale. What 0 would mean far left, and 10 far right, and 5 in the middle. And most of the people could position themselves on, and then we looked whether there's a correlation between left and right-wing thinking on the one hand, and pro and anti-capitalism approach on the other hand. But of course, it's correct that right has much different meaning. There are some people, for example, I would describe myself as a moderate right. If you're on this from 0 to 10, I would position myself, for example, with 7 today. But what does it mean? For me, it means more freedom is more important than equality. For example, this is very important. For left people, always equality is the most important thing. But of course, there are right-wing nationalists like some Trump supporters and so, who don't like economic freedom in any way. And so right-wing can mean a lot of different things if it comes to topics like and there are some topics, of course, where it's not so easy to differentiate between left and right. For example, now at this conference, there were a lot of advocates for abolish, or how to say it, for free truck use, cannabis and also other trucks. And in a way, in Germany, it's more like left-leaning people support this, and conservative people are against it. But
yeah, one of the things I thought was so interesting about your work was particularly your 2020 book, The Rich in Public Opinion, which, as you mentioned before, sprung out of this observation that of all of the groups that we're not supposed to have any prejudice against, and we are hypersensitive to not having any bias against any preferred minority. But we kind of look the other way, or it doesn't raise any eyebrows with regards to what, of course, Ayn Rand talked about as the most persecuted minority. Of course, she was referring to big business rather than the financially successful per se. But I was really fascinated by your social envy coefficient, which, if I get it right, indicates the ratio of social enviers to non-enviers. You looked at different countries. You looked at France, I think Germany, Spain. Tell us about, you looked at the US and the UK. So tell us about your methodology, and also what did you find? So I thought that was just fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. So I commissioned a poll first for this book, but now it's ongoing. We after the book was published, we did it in a lot of other countries, and it was about the attitude toward rich people, and especially about envy. And first, if we speak about envy, there's almost no one who admits being envious. I'm not envious, these are the others. We know there's a research, we call it envious research. You find a chapter there in my book. I didn't know it before, that there's really a field of research about envy. And one of the results is that people can admit almost all emotions, even hate or whatever, but not to being envious, because it means that if you admit to being envious, it means you admit that there's someone who has something that you want to have and that you would like to have. And then this leads to the question, why do I not have it? And this could be very uncomfortable for your self-conscious soul. And so people don't, and so you have to find a way, if you want to find out whether someone is envious or not. You can't ask them, are you envious or not? You have to ask some questions that we call it indicator questions, where you can find out, for example, what means envy? Envy means you want to reduce the gap between you and someone who's rich, for example, not by improving your own situation, but by tearing the other person down, by making his situation worse, not make your situation better, but make his situation worse. And so we had some questions as, for example, I would favor drastically more that millionaires should pay much higher taxes, even if I have no personal advantage. Another statement was, I'm in favor of drastically reducing the compensation, CEO compensation of top managers, and distribute it more evenly among their employees, even if everyone has only $2 more. The same principle, to make situation worse for someone, even if everyone has not really an advantage. Or another question was, we called it the Schadenfreude question. It was this question, if I hear that millionaire lose a lot of money due to a risky business, I think it serves him right. So if people, have fun when it's bad for others. And so we had a lot of questions, and in the end, we could.
And you also had questions about attitudes towards millionaires or attitudes towards wealthy people, right?
Yes, there were a lot of questions, and in the end, we could distinguish between two groups: the enviers and the non-enviers, as you mentioned before. And in the middle, there were some, we call them the ambivalent words, not really clear. And the social envy coefficient that you mentioned, it's exactly, you grabbed it, it's the ratio between enviers and non-enviers in the country. And to make it a little bit easier, the purpose was to find one number to compare different countries, how envious are people. So every number bigger than 1 means that there are more envious than non-envious, and every number smaller than 1 means that there are more non-envious. And now we did it in 12 countries, and the most envious people are in France.
Not a huge surprise there, but
not a really surprise. I tell you a funny story about France. I mentioned my next book will be published in 27 countries all over the world, but I was not successful to find only one publisher in France. It will be even published in Nepal and Mongolia, and it will be published in Japan and Korea, everywhere. But there was not one single publisher in France. I tried very hard to publish only one of my books. So it's easier to publish some of my books in China than in France. So by the way, and we had another survey. Only at a footnote, I can tell you later something about this. In defense of capitalism, for this, my next book, we had another survey about the attitude toward capitalism. And one of the results was that the most anti-capitalist people you can find in France. So it was not a surprise. Followed by Germany. So
France was very I think it was a 1.6 ratio of enviers.
1.26 was
1.26, okay. And then Germany also high enviers, Spain high enviers, and then UK was low enviers right after that.
UK lower, and United States much lower, but in United States there's a big difference between older and younger Americans. Older Americans were exactly the way as we in Europe think about Americans, in favor of private business, capitalism, rich people, and the younger were more critical to rich people and capital. So there was a huge difference. By the way, in Italy, it was the other way around. The younger people were more pro-rich and the older one were more, it's different in every country.
Yeah, that I thought it was interesting that it flipped, that in France and in Italy and in Germany, even though that they were higher in their coefficient, had more enviers, you saw that flip a little bit, that if you found non-enviers, they tended to be younger than in the United States, higher percentage of non-enviers. But very disturbingly, that also flipped, that the young were more likely to have negative views about rich people and negative views about capitalism. So,
and the most positive attitude and the least envious people are in Japan and Vietnam. I did now, you can find it on the internet if you Google. I published a paper about social envy in Asian countries, Economic Affairs. It's a British libertarian journal, and I published an article there. You can find it free on the internet. And there you see that people in Vietnam, especially in Japan, are least envious. And I was now in Vietnam. It was very interesting because this is the only university who grabbed my idea, and they do now their own research about envy against rich people. And they invited me at the Foreign Trade University in Hanoi. They invited me to a workshop about envy against rich people and what can you do against envy against rich people. Imagine such a workshop in sociology in the United States or in Europe. It's not...
Well, one of the takeaways that I have is that since knowing a millionaire greatly reduced the amount of envy that you had, right? So that I thought was interesting. And that's one of the reasons that the Atlas Society, among the subjects that we dramatize in our animated Draw My Life videos, are entrepreneurs like Chip Wilson, like Peter Diamandis. We do interviews with Michael Saylor and other billionaires and hear their stories, because, hey, we might not all be able to meet or get to know personally a millionaire or billionaire, but at least we can give you a little bit of insight into their worlds. So what do you make of the, what are the factors that are contributing to a society with greater prevalence of enviers? What are some of the implications for the kinds of policies and governments that they invite?
Let's allow me first to come short back what you mentioned, because it's a very important point. We asked also everyone in our survey whether they know a millionaire or some millionaires in person. And most people do not know in person. And then we asked this group, what do you think about personality traits of millionaires? For example, we presented to every one of our respondents with a list of 14 personality traits, 7 positive and 7 negative. For example, positive personality trait, honest. And in most countries, it was this way. For example, 1 or 2 or 3% of the general population said rich people are honest. And then we asked only those people who knew a millionaire in person about his personality traits. And then there were much more people who said he's honest. For example, 20% instead of 1%. It was in all countries where we did the survey, there was a huge gap. And so I appreciate very much that you give people the opportunity when it's not in person, but even there to learn a little bit more about rich people and successful entrepreneurs, because this is the big problem, that most of the people know them only from media, like Hollywood movies. And I have one chapter in this book. I did research about the image of rich people in Hollywood movies. And I think it comes not as a big surprise that it's an overall negative image, rich people in Hollywood movies. And I can tell you maybe a funny story. I had an interview with, similar to our interview, but the interview was very left-leaning. But in a way, he liked me and I liked him as a person. And in the end of the interview, he asked me, please be honest for a moment. Isn't it this way that the rich people are in reality the same way as we know it from the James Bond movies? So this was his question. And I asked him, okay, one question. How many multi-billionaires do you know in person? 0. How many billionaires do you know in person? 0. How many people who have some hundreds of millions do you know in person? Zero. How many millionaires do you know in person? Zero. He knew not even one millionaire. And then I said, okay, there's a difference between you and me. You know them from James Bond movies. I know them, for example, from my interviews, from my doctoral dissertation. So he had to laugh a little bit, because this is about prejudice. You speak about people that you don't know. You hear only in the media something about them. But sorry,
Right.
this was only
no. I think that, well, I want to, because we've got about 15 more minutes, and I don't want to neglect all of these people that are popping in with their questions, some of which actually have specifically to do with Germany. So I would want to try to get to Kingfisher's question from Facebook. Thoughts on the recent economic insolvency happening in Germany?
In Germany, it's a very bad situation. It's
yeah, I mean, it's that, and there's the energy crisis, and there's
a lot. The first thing is that since the time of Angela Merkel, we go more and more in the direction of a planned economy. They don't call it a planned economy, but in fact it is. And the energy policy is only a perfect example. It has nothing to do with a market. There was a very good article 3 years ago in Wall Street Journal. The headline was "The dumbest energy policy in the world," and it was about Germany. Because first we phased out nuclear power plants, we forbid fracking, we then made the decision to phase out coal power plants in the hope that we can do all with solar energy and with windmills, but they are not there. It's like the same, you are not happy with your house and you tear down your house the first, even before you have the key to another house, and even you don't have the building permission for another house. And this is exactly what happened now. Of course, it's very crazy. It's ideology driven. And in German newspapers, there are every day in our article how to prepare for blackout that can happen maybe in a few months, blackout. But I made a joke on Twitter. I said, don't call it blackout, call it green out, because this fits better. Call it green out.
That's great. That's great.
By the way, if you say blackout, maybe some people can think it's racist, because you shouldn't do something with black with negative connotations. So call it green out. And it's only one example.
But I just got my Tesla power walls. So even living in California, hopefully no more greenouts for me. Also getting to Europe, I got a question here, Eisen on Facebook, or actually Instagram, asking, are European countries primarily socialist countries with capitalist elements, or are they capitalist countries with socialist elements?
I think all over the world, there is nowhere pure capitalism and there's nowhere pure socialism. It's all a mixture between both elements today. I compare it also, I call it the test tube theory. I have it in my book, The Power of Capitalism. Imagine you have a test tube with two ingredients, market and state, or capitalism and socialism. And then you see what happens if you add more market, as they did in China or in Vietnam in the last 40 years, or if you add more state, as they did in Venezuela, for example, in the last 20 years. And so I think this is important to understand economic development, even if there is, the great thing is with capitalism, you don't need pure capitalism. Even a little bit of capitalism can help a lot. As you saw, give your example from, before I speak about Europe, give your example from Vietnam, because I was there. A lot of people don't know this. 1993, Vietnam was the poorest country in the world, even poorer than all African countries. And 80% lived in poverty. Today it's less than 5%. Why is that? Because they started 1986 with pro-market reforms. And of course, it's not a pure capitalist country. They call themselves socialists, but I can guarantee you, you can find more Marxists in the United States than you will find in Vietnam. But you see what happened. And in Europe, for me, it's a mixed system. for example, in Germany, after Second World War, with this policy of Ludwig Erhard, this was our success story with market economy. And this was the secret. And then they added more and more state. And in the beginning of the 2000s, we had some pro-market reforms in Germany. Then the situation became better. And now we go back again in the direction of more planned economy. Poland, another example. Poland is the most successful European country in the last 25 years. You have to know they were the poorest country in the Eastern Bloc in socialist times, poorer than the Ukraine, and they had only half of GDP per capita than Czech Republic. And then they started with their economic reforms pro-market, but now again they go back to more state. And so it's always a thing that develops. And the big problem, not only in Europe, almost everywhere in the world, if you compare the situation in the beginning of the 80s, we had a lot of pro-market reforms. We had Maggie Thatcher in the UK. We had Ronald Reagan in the United States. We had Deng Xiaoping in China. We had the so-called Doi Mo reforms in Vietnam. Even in Argentina at this time, or in Italy, you had a little bit of pro-market reforms. And now it's the opposite. Everywhere where you look, in China, they go back to more state. In the United States, of course, they go back more state. In Europe, they go back to more state. And this is the reason why it's so important what you do with your work, because it's a really terrible situation now.
Yes, and politics, they say, is downstream from culture, but culture is downstream from philosophy, which is why we believe it's so important to convey the philosophy and the ideas of Ayn Rand to a public that is largely completely oblivious to who she is and to what her ideas stand for.
By the way, I can tell you a funny story. I know an Ayn Rand fan here in Berlin, and he has a small group, and I made him a suggestion, but he didn't do it. I don't know why. We have in Berlin a lot of street names with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, a lot of them.
Wow.
And I suggested him, please go there in the night and make their Ayn Rand street.
Ayn Rand, yeah.
And make some photos. And of course, people will not know, who is this? Never heard of them. But then you have an idea how to talk about it. Yes,
there you go.
Didn't do it, but I think it's a good idea.
Like Ayn Rand Street, John Galt Street, the Gulch Avenue. So tell us a little bit about your Ayn Rand discovery. And I know you're a nonfiction guy, but obviously she had some of the best essays on envy. The way that she talked about it really was not about coveting what somebody else has, but about wanting others not to have it, wanting others to suffer and to die. It was the hatred of the good for being good. So tell us a bit about what her work means to you.
Yes, the last thing that was very important, maybe I mentioned this because this was very important. For my next book, In Defense of Capitalism, I have one chapter about monopolies. And I read some papers or essays that they wrote about monopolies and about this antitrust policy. And it was so amazing for me because even some people who call themselves pro-free market or classic liberal today, they have always this crazy things against monopolies. Even I don't speak only about left-leaning people. Of course, they always tell, oh, how dangerous is the monopoly. The same time, they are in favor for state monopoly. What is I will never understand how to fight against monopolies to have then the absolute monopoly, the state monopoly. But I don't speak about left-leaning people. I speak about people who call themselves classic liberal or even libertarian, and they are, yes, we have to do something. They have this emotion against big business and against monopolies. And so this was for me very important to read her essays because this was exactly the same as I thought. I found it from her and from a few others. I found it also from, I have a friend at Beijing University, his name is Chang Wang, and he had the same, he wrote the same as Ayn Rand did about monopolies. And you can never make it right. If you make the prices too high, then they say it's like a monopoly price, and if you make it too low, it's not. And I believed what she wrote, that it's crazy to say the state should do something against the monopolies, because the biggest enemy of monopolies is free market and is capitalism. And and now today we see that she was right. I give you only two or three examples. If the monopoly is on the height of their power, always people think it will never go away, it's everlasting monopoly. But this is not true. I found an article 2007 in Guardian, in this British newspaper, with the headline, "Will MySpace ever lose its monopoly?" Who knows MySpace today? And there was, the same year, on the cover of Forbes magazine, it was about the Nokia, that they will never lose their monopoly. Who knows about Nokia today? And you know, in the United States, it happened with Kodak, it happened with Xerox, for example. And you had a lot of companies that you called a monopoly, and today there are in insolvency, or they have only minor market share. And this proves that she was right, because this happened all about monopolies, but reality proved her right. That because all of these monopolies I mentioned now, or so-called monopolies, like Xerox or Kodak, or a lot of others, they were not ended by antitrust policy, but by capitalism.
Yeah, by upstart competitors.
Yes.
So we're about at time. I know it sounds like you've got a bunch of your books planned out and your travel schedule planned out. Tell us the best way to keep track of you, and hopefully hear about announcements of your upcoming books and the upcoming adaptations of your books into audio format, as we discussed. Should we follow you on Twitter or sign up for newsletter? What's our...
Oh, to be honest, I do not enough on Twitter in English language, a little bit, but not enough. And of course, I think most of your audience cannot understand German, or have to change it. No, the best is to read my books. And I wrote 27 books, and of course, I cannot expect everyone to read every book, but I think I can recommend to everyone my book, The Power of Capitalism. We haven't spoken about this today, but this is a very important book. This is with a chapter about the intellectuals, so it's good that we didn't talk about it, so people are maybe a little bit more curious to...
No spoilers.
to order it. And my next book will be published in January, In Defense of... You find in the bibliography, I used 360 scientific papers and books. And I did a poll and a lot of this. And I have 10 chapters about all this popular myth against capitalism. For example, capitalism is to blame for hunger and poverty. Capitalism is to blame for inequality. Capitalism is to blame for climate change, environmental degradation. Capitalism is to blame for monopolies, for greed. The chapter about greed and egoism, of course. Also, you find in some chapters a lot of Ayn Rand quotes there in the book. But my idea was that if you have a discussion with anti-capitalists, you can't be good on all of these topics, like monopolies or inequality, to really have all the facts. And even you don't have to read the whole book, but if you know, for example, next week in your university, there will be a discussion about inequality or about climate change, then read only one chapter, and I guarantee you have all the facts that you need. And so this is maybe my most important book.
We are looking forward to it, and perhaps you'll come back and join us for when it's published. So Thank you so much, Dr. Zitelman. I really appreciate it. This was fascinating. Thank you for your work. And I want to
thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak to you, and I hope first we will meet in person, very important, hopefully so, and meet in person next few months. Hopefully in January we will have our next conversation, or if you invite me to some of your conference, I would be very happy to come there. I can guarantee I'm very happy to come there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of us today. Thanks for all of the excellent questions as well. As always, if you enjoyed this video, being a free rider and just enjoying something and not exchanging something of value, then consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Atlas Society to support our work. Please consider tuning in next week as well. I'm going to be interviewing Walter Isaacson, of course, the great American biographer. So I'm looking forward to that. And
I read his book, so about Albert Einstein, for example.
Yes.
His book about Steve Jobs. I read a lot of his books. Amazing that you have the privilege to speak with him. It's amazing.
Well, you know, you're going to be a hard act to follow, but we're looking forward to it. And hopefully you'll tune in as well and ask some of your questions. So
I can guarantee you one thing, his English will be much better than mine.
Oh, no, your English is fantastic.
No, I tell you a funny story. I had this discussion with free to choose people, and they're like, yes, but you have this German accent. I know, but imagine, Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'm a little bit like him. He has also this German accent, and he became very successful. So hopefully